There's a scripture I want us to reflect on as I speak, and it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And you all know this scripture. It's when Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he's talking about the challenges that he's facing, and he's humbled by this thorn in his flesh, and he's complaining about the difficulties he's having, and he's asked God 3 times to take the thorn away. And then Paul writes in chapter 9, he says, "And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." And then he says, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And then in verse 10 he writes, "Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake." Because he says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." You know, and sometimes we forget that the great apostle Paul was once the felon Saul. He was the person who wreaked havoc on the church, and he was persecuted and prosecuted for all of this havoc. He was a convicted criminal. And yet God transformed him into this great apostle. And I want us to reflect on that today. I am so thrilled that this community has begun a ministry for people who are dealing with convictions, people who are recovering from our criminal justice system. This church is modeling something for the entire faith community, and I'm so proud to see it here. I really am. We need to see this all over this country because there's a great need. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. There are 6 million people on probation or parole in this country. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get jobs and they try to get loans, they're often disfavored by that arrest history. We've done some terrible things to women in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, the percentage of women going to jails and prisons has increased 646%. The statistic that keeps me up latest at night, though, is the one that I have to share with you. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century when many of us were born. It was not true in the 19th century. It has become true in the 21st century. And so we need ministry, we need intervention, we need to respond to this crisis that we are facing in this country. And I could spend all morning talking about the problems, but I really want to share a word that I think is rooted in solution. I've got 4 things to say to those believers who understand the power of redemption and grace for this community. There are 4 things I want to talk to you about. The first is, I believe that God's people are called to be proximate, to be close to those who have fallen down. I believe we are called to make a commitment to get proximate to those who are in jails and in prisons. We've got to make a commitment to get closer to the people and the places where they're suffering. You see, there's a lot of people who were taught their whole lives, if there's a bad part of town, if there are places in Dallas where the crime rates are high, where there's a lot of abuse, where there's a lot of neglect, where there's a lot of drug addiction and a lot of despair, many of us have been taught, stay as far away from those parts of town as possible. But I believe God is calling a people who are willing to do the opposite, or willing to get proximate to the poor and the abused and the neglected and the suffering. And I say that because I'm actually persuaded that there is power in proximity. When we get close to those who have been excluded, when we get close to those who have suffered, when we get close to those who have been incarcerated, when we get close to the condemned, we understand something about grace and power we can't understand from a distance. Got a lot of politicians coming up with solutions, and their solutions don't work because they're so far away from the problems, they can't see the details. You've got to get close to these problems to understand it. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. When I was a little boy, I had to go to the colored school. They didn't let black kids go to the public school. There were no high schools for black children in my county. When my dad was a teenager, he couldn't go to high school. And then one day, these lawyers came into our community and they made them open up the public schools. And because they made them open up the public schools, I got to go to high school. I had the great privilege of going to college. I went to a Christian college, Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. I loved college. I loved the environment. It was a wondrous place, and I'd never been any place like that. And when I got to college, I made the decision. I said, you know what? I love college so much, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mom. I said, Mom, I've made a decision. I said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. My mom said, I didn't go to college, Bryan, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. And I was a philosophy major, and when I became a senior, I'd go out on the hillside because I thought as a philosophy major, I was supposed to think these big, deep thoughts, and I was out there one day, and somebody came up to me and said, you are a senior, and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I started thinking about it, and I heard it as a hostile question because I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. So I started looking into graduate school because nobody in my family had gone to school. I didn't know what I'm sure everybody here knows. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was very intimidated by that, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It became very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. And so I signed up for that, and a few months later found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, deeply disillusioned. I was worried because they weren't talking about race, they weren't talking about poverty, they weren't talking about social inequality, and I thought, this isn't for me, and I kept struggling, and I couldn't find my way, and after 2 years, I was still struggling, and I was about to do this thing I'm going to pray all of you never do. I was about to do this thing where I tried to rationalize accepting a career as a lawyer that I knew would not fulfill me, that I knew was not my purpose, that I knew was not going to animate my life, but I was trying to persuade myself that's what you do. You just do the thing that you have to do, even if you don't feel excited about it. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend a month working with death row prisoners in Georgia. And I found this organization where these lawyers got up early in the morning, they worked hard all day, they stayed up late at night, their lives were animated by this work. And I'd been there a week when one of the lawyers said, we need you to go to death row and just explain to a man that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. I got in my car, I drove down there to death row, and I was nervous because I realized this man was going to be disappointed when he discovered that I was just a law student. And I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and they parked my car, and I went into the prison, and the prison was dark and intimidating, and the guards took me to the visitation room, and I was so nervous. And I kept pacing back and forth, and finally they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned man I'd ever seen. And what I remember about that man is that he was burdened with chains. He had handcuffs around his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain this man. And I was standing there getting even more anxious, and finally they unchained him, and he walked over to me and he said, hi, my name is, and I just was so afraid. I said, I'm so sorry. I said, I'm just a law student. I said, I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. I don't know anything about anything, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man stopped me. He said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you are the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard. And then the man said, I've been calling my wife at night and I've been talking to my children, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife. I'm going to see my kids. He said, thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate could have an impact on the quality of someone's life. That man and I started talking. It turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birth date, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I started asking him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. And quickly, 45 minutes turned into an hour. An hour turned into 2 hours. 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour. And the guards were getting angry that I was staying so long, but we were still talking. And after 3 hours, the guards couldn't bear it any longer. They came bursting into the room, and they were angry. They couldn't do anything to me, but they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms behind him, and they put the handcuffs back on his wrists. They wrapped the chain around his waist so tightly I could see him grimacing in pain. I begged them to be gentle. I said, look, it's my fault, not his fault. Please don't take it out on him. But they ignored me. Then they put the shackles back on his ankles. I could see the metal pinching his skin. The man was struggling. I said, please, be gentler. It's not his fault, it's my fault. But the condemned man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. They started shoving this man toward the door. He almost fell down, and I was watching in horror at the way they were treating him. They were pushing him so roughly, and they got him near the door. And then I watched this man do something. When they got him near the door, they were about to shove him out, but he planted his feet. And the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then that man turned at me, and he looked at me and said, "Bryan, don't you worry about this. You just come back." And then I stood there and watched that man do something I've never forgotten my whole life. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes. And then he threw his head back. And then he started to sing. And he started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way." He said, "New heights I'm gaining every day." He said, "Still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." And everybody stopped, the guards stopped, and then they started resuming, pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And all of a sudden, I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew that I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. I knew that my journey was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get to higher ground, I can't get to higher ground. And I'm telling you, there's power in proximity. When we get close to the incarcerated and the convicted, when we get close to the poor and the abused, when we get close to those who have been drug addicted, we get close to those who have been abused and neglected, we're going to find God's power manifesting itself in ways that you cannot imagine. And the church has to get closer to those who have been thrown away, those who have been beat down. There is power in proximity.